You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
Try to slice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood art Ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today we're looking at Tiziano Vecellio, better known simply as Titian. And a shout out and a big thank you to Christos for suggesting the topic for today's episode. Now, Titian was one of the leading artists at the height of the Renaissance in Venice. He was born in Pieve di Cadore, a small town in the Alps, likely around 1488 or 1490. As a kid, he moved to Venice, the floating city. Titian studied under the local master Giovanni Bellini. By the time he was in his late 20s, his teachers had passed away, leaving Titian without any serious competition. For the next 60 years, he dominated the Venetian art scene. What set Titian apart immediately was his handling of paint and his color. He was famous for establishing the importance of chariot, or coloring over drawing. In fact, he became literally synonymous with color. There's actually a color named after him, Titian Red, referring to the golden orange hair color he frequently gave the women in his portraits. But it wasn't just about mixing the reds. Titian had wealth which gave him access to colors other artists really couldn't compete with. He was able to afford large amounts of high-grade ultramarine blue, a pigment that was very expensive because it came from crushed lapis lazuli stones imported from a remote region in the mountains of Afghanistan. It was very labor-intensive to get it because the lapis lazuli stones would yield a very small percentage of usable pigment. If I recall correctly, it was like single digits, maybe 3 or 5% was usable pigment from every lapis lazuli stone. Other artists just couldn't afford to use that much of it. I mean, ounce for ounce, it was more valuable than gold. So a lot of other artists would use cheaper, duller hues, saving the ultramarine just for the most important figures. And that's why we see blue veils on important figures like the Virgin Mary in religious paintings. But Titian was able to afford to use this expensive ultramarine very generously, making his skies and fabrics just much more intense than his rivals could achieve. Pretty quickly, word of Titian's talent spread, and he drew the attention of very powerful leading figures from around the world. He didn't just paint for local churches, he was the court painter for the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. And Titian had almost like a celebrity status that was unheard of for a craftsman at the time. You got to remember, for much of history, artists weren't celebrated figures. They were just kind of everyday laborers. They were craftsmen. There's a famous story, though, that Titian was painting the emperor's portrait, and he accidentally dropped his paintbrush. Strictly speaking, an emperor would never bow or stoop for anyone, but the story goes Charles V picked up the brush and handed it back to Titian. When Titian tried to apologize, saying he wasn't worthy of such service, the emperor replied, quote, "Titian is worthy to be served by Caesar." Now, whether that is 100% fact or legend, it just goes to show that Titian was viewed as nobility and not just an ordinary worker. Later in his career, Titian began working for the emperor's son, King Philip II of Spain. And under this patronage, he had a sort of artistic breakthrough. Titian didn't like being told exactly what to paint. He wanted more creative freedom. When he painted a series of myths for the king, he called them poesie, or visual poems. By using this term, Titian was arguing that painting was a liberal art equal to poetry. He claimed the right to interpret the myths in his own way rather than just illustrating a text, showing that an artist could be a storyteller as well. As Titian grew older, he remained obsessed with his work and getting paid for it. Historians say he may have actually lied about his age in order to elicit some sympathy and get his payments from the king. In a letter to Philip II, written in 1571, Titian claimed to be 95 years old. If that's true, that he was 95 in 1571, then Titian would have lived to over 100. But most records suggest he was exaggerating to appear more frail so the king would finally pay his overdue debts. Titian was likely closer to 85 or 90 when he passed away, which is still incredibly long for the 16th century. In those final years, Titian's style changed drastically, probably due to common ailments associated with age, like failing eyesight and shaking hands. His early work was crisp, sharply focused, and realistic, but his late work became much more loose and expressive. One of his students even said that Titian would abandon his brushes entirely, painting with his fingers, just smearing the oil paint directly on the canvas with his thumb to soften and blend the shadows. So you might make the argument that he was centuries ahead of his time because he was developing those kinds of direct painting methods and the impasto that we would later celebrate in the Impressionist movement. But now I want to take a moment to look at one of his greatest and most famous masterpieces. I'm talking about Bacchus and Ariadne. This is a huge painting, about 6 feet by 6 feet. It was created between 1520 and 1523. It was commissioned by Alphonse d'Este, the Duke of Ferrara, for his private study called the Camerino de Alabastro. The Duke wanted a room filled with art based on classical mythology. Originally, this specific wall was actually assigned to a different Italian Renaissance painter, Raphael, but Raphael passed away unexpectedly, so the job fell to Titian. And this really puts some immense pressure on him because, Raphael, those are some hard shoes to fill. And not only that, but this work would hang right next to the painting by his own teacher, Giovanni Bellini. Now, this painting is showing a moment from Greek mythology as told by the Roman poets Ovid and Catullus. The story is split into 2 parts on the canvas. On the far left, we see a blue ocean and a ship sailing away in the distance. This is the ship of Theseus, the hero who killed the Minotaur. He has just abandoned the Princess Ariadne on the island of Naxos, and we see Ariadne on the shore waving at the ship, frozen in a moment of heartbreak and betrayal. But her sorrow is interrupted by an explosion of noise and color coming from the right. This is the arrival of Bacchus, the god of wine. He bursts onto the scene with a rowdy procession of satyrs and followers playing cymbals and tambourines. The painting is capturing the exact moment when Bacchus and Ariadne lock eyes and Bacchus falls in love instantly. Titian paints Bacchus in a crazy active pose. He's leaping out of his chariot, suspended in midair with his pink cape fluttering behind him. He looks like he's about to crash right out of the painting and into the viewer. And this creates a sharp diagonal line that cuts the painting effectively in half. On the top left, representing Ariadne, we see blue, calm, and orderly composition, while the bottom right is earthy toned and chaotic, representing Bacchus. And Titian, thinking of his painting as visual poetry, decided to include all sorts of rich details. We see Bacchus's chariot pulled by 2 cheetahs, and Titian was painting these based on sketches of the Duke's own, I guess you might say, private zoo animals. The Duke actually used cheetahs for hunting. In the bottom right, a figure struggles with snakes, and this is referencing a statue that had recently been discovered in Rome, but it's also kind of Titian signaling that he was educated and knowledgeable of classical art. And finally, we see Titian kind of painting the ending of the story in the sky. When you look at the top left, above Ariadne's head, there's a circle of 8 stars. This is the constellation Corona Borealis, or the Northern Crown. In the myth, Bacchus promises to turn Ariadne's crown into a constellation to immortalize her. So this little detail kind of brings closure to the story. Titian shows us the past with the ship, the present with the leap, and the future with the constellation, all in one unified composition. And that's kind of the brilliance of Titian's work. He brought together all the elements with the rich colors, dynamic movement, and storytelling that brings new life into the ancient myths. This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.